Hello and welcome back to the Creating Value in Schools podcast with me, Liz Worthen, where we talk about ways to work more sustainably in schools. And one area that seems to be causing an energy drain for staff at the moment and is taking up time, creating stress, is pupil behaviour. So I'm very happy to be joined today by Dee Higgins, who's had a long career as a teacher and as a senior leader in a pupil referral unit, and is now supporting schools through the local authority as a therapeutic thinking lead, which sounds like a really intriguing role that we're going to find out more about. But let's start by getting a flavour of what you're doing at the moment, Dee. What is it that's taking you into schools? What are they finding challenging? What are they seeking your help with?
Well, it's interesting you should ask. My role is predominantly going into a wide range of schools, cross phase, so primary, secondary, and special schools. And my role is to go in and encourage senior leaders and teachers and anyone who works in the school to consider restorative and reflective practices. And that means really being curious around behaviour and thinking about what lies beneath behaviour. What's the lived experience of a child? How does that come out through their feelings and maybe through their behaviour? In a busy school, it's really easy just to look at the behaviour and deal with the face value of what you're faced with. And sometimes that can be quite a challenge for the teacher to unpick and manage. My role is to go in to encourage staff in schools to look at what's underneath that behaviour and maybe think of an approach earlier on in that relational practice that might move that child away from acting in a detrimental way that may affect their own learning and also the learning of others. So it's really encouraging staff to step back a bit and consider their role in the relationship and how they can encourage young people to reflect on and change behaviour through relational practices.
Sounds really interesting. Yeah. I was just thinking back to my teaching days, and there are sometimes, yeah, when you're in the thick of the classroom and there's content you're trying to get through, you're conscious that you've got to do this stuff, and there's 30 kids, and yeah, there's a student who's playing up or is just, yeah, not behaving in a way which feels conducive to the procedure of your lesson. As it's quite hard. It can be
Mm.
hard in that moment, can't it? I imagine to say, okay, let's take a step back and be curious.
I think it's about being the calmest person in that space and responding to a child in a very clear and precise communicative style that isn't complicated in vocabulary, because when a child is highly dysregulated, they're not going to be taking on board what you're saying. They are going to be in a state of dysregulation. So if you prioritize regulation and tapping into where that child is emotionally, they are far more likely to come back on track. Whereas if you respond in a punitive way, it generally won't get the response that you want, and it certainly won't be a learning experience for the child around behaviour.
And I suppose as well, it's not just for teaching staff, is it? I guess for
No.
staff encountering children around the school or in the dinner hall or in the corridors at any time. But I think what you're saying is, Dee, isn't it, that it kind of starts with you as the adult, the way you approach or the way you are.
I mean, a common phrase now, and we do hear it more, is connection before correction. And I think it is about the relational practices from the get-go when the child isn't in a dysregulated state. So it is that meet and greet at the door, be that calm, present, curious person and inquire. And it is about the pace as well, being playful, acceptance and curious, and really empathizing where a child may be at. I mean, I know this just from my experience being with children in a pupil referral unit who present often highly dysregulated, and it's a trauma response sometimes to things that have happened in their lived experience, or it might have been something that happened on the bus in. And to be the person that notices that there's something that might not be quite right and is able to respond in a relational way to inquire about what might be behind their feelings, thoughts, and behaviour, to get them into a place where there's acceptance and a sense of belonging. Again, that's something that's spoken about more now, about belonging and feeling a sense of belonging and safety in a school. I think that it's the smallest of interactions on a regular, consistent basis that will start to ensure that a child feels safe and they belong in a school. And everyone has a role to play in that. So when I go into schools, I say, look, you have agency in this situation. You are the adult who can develop that relationship. Nobody's going to come in particularly and manage that behavior for you. And the repair won't happen if you ask somebody else to deal with it. It's actually about having the conversation with the child when the time is right. And I'm not saying that everything needs to be a big restorative conversation. It's that small moments of capturing opportunities when a child is regulated to speak about what they've learned from a place when they were dysregulated and how they would do things differently. A lot of my roles in school is going in and helping staff with providing scripts around restorative conversations. And that, again, it's about, you can try and you can fail. It's okay, but being consistent in an approach and trying it at least is better than responding in a punitive manner, I believe.
Yeah. And just tell me a bit more about this term relational approach. Perhaps interestingly, I saw that in a slightly different context just earlier this week about talking about relational leadership. And I suppose that's probably not dissimilar. But yeah, tell me a bit more. What does that mean, a relational approach?
It's really getting to understand where you are in that dynamic and where the child is in the dynamic, not only with you, but also with the rest of the class. And it is about being curious about what makes them tick and what approaches they respond well to and how you feel in that relationship. So it is a bit of checking in around yourselves and your own emotions. And I think this stems for me, this goes back a long way. I mean, I've been doing this for over 20 years. I was fortunate enough to do a master's in psychotherapy many years ago, and that was about relational approaches and your unconscious processes that happen in a relationship and the dynamics of groups. So I think it's been a firm foundation for me for many years, and I know it's more in vogue now, and there's way more writing around it, and there's some really good authors who are providing materials and sources for schools. And there's a lot around trauma-informed practices and nurture approaches. I think I'm just pleased that we're in a position now in education where this is becoming more commonplace as a discussion. The concern I have, I think, still is there's a mismatch between some of the DFE guidance around zero tolerance, and it doesn't mean that a relational approach is a soft option. It just means that we consider the behaviour curriculum and the positive responses that you can have with children to get them to think around their behaviour. And I firmly believe it extends beyond the classroom. So when I go into school, I don't just look at what's happening in a class or in a lesson. I do encourage senior leaders and staff to see what's happening in the corridors, in the playground, and at lunchtime, and prioritising experiences where children feel that they get a sense of play. There's some wonderful practices in primary schools at the moment around opal playgrounds and giving that space in a school where children can discover their strengths and enjoyment in a non-structured way. And I think opal playgrounds really exemplify that process.
I was talking about playtimes just this week, and actually, yeah, that importance of giving children opportunities to play and supporting them to do that, because then also that may well be, if children have a chance to play and socialize and work out how to sort out problems together, you then might find that your afternoon goes a bit better. Rather than that, it was always like the dreaded period 5, that after lunch slot, which is when things always would also often go a little bit awry.
And it's quite nuanced as well, because you've got to be mindful where a child is during play and lunchtime and what that space signifies for them, not just in school but outside of school. So food is a very important aspect, and how a school manages lunchtimes and what is on offer at lunchtime and the equity around lunchtime. I was visiting a school recently and their lunchtime is around families. It was children sat round tables together having conversations, serving food to each other, and acting in a relational way and supporting one another through that time of the day. And everyone had the same food. And I thought that was wonderful because actually it takes away, it puts in a layer of equity at that time when children can feel quite vulnerable in a very structured and well managed way. And I think it was a really good practice that I was able to be part of and experience. And it really stood out as a relational practice school, and that was one aspect. So it is thinking about all aspects of the school day, from the moment the children get on a bus, really, to when they leave and go to an after school club. Another piece of work I've been doing is working with organisations to provide activities during holiday time, and how linking the emotional vocabulary and relational practice across schools into those spaces. So there is that consistency from being in school to being in a play setting, and the expectations around relational practices are consistent. I suppose a priority of mine really is to go in and talk about emotional vocabulary and use of consistent use of language with parents, children, the community and the school. So you've got a sense of commonality, and that's where you get children feeling emotionally safe, and parents, because you know that everyone is using the same language and vocabulary. And again, it stretches into that lens of equity, so people know what to expect. So I think that's where I feel around relational practices and equity, that there is that consistency of approach.
And yes, you mentioned parents there, because I suppose it's a lot of talk as well at the moment about parents and relationships with parents. So I suppose, yeah, the relational approach, you say, it can extend to how we talk to parents or how we encourage parents to talk with their children as well.
Absolutely. I've been doing a few workshops in co-production with teaching staff and staff in schools with parents to explore behaviour policy, to ensure that parents, in the best possible scenario, are part of a co-production around behaviour policy. But where behaviour policy is established and there has been nuance or blocks, that parents get an opportunity to have a discussion around it so that they understand it. Again, best practice I've seen is where there has been co-production with parents around policy, so that there is a full understanding of what that relational policy means in a school. And when a child comes home and is using vocabulary that is based in that policy and in a behaviour curriculum, that parent has an understanding, and it does give them a sense of agency and are more likely to be supportive of the actions of a school if they fully understand where the school is coming from.
And I guess I've got to ask, because as you alluded to earlier, behavior is an area of debate. There are
Mm.
different feelings about it. What would you say to the people who say, but children shouldn't have to take all this effort in understanding the child in that moment? Children just need to learn how to behave.
How do you feel as an adult, when you're treated in a non-relational, punitive way? And the world of work is changing and the world is changing. And I think harking back to an era where people sat in rows and were silent in corridors and classrooms doesn't necessarily mean that a child is learning. And we spend a lot of time talking about the introverts and extroverts in a classroom. And actually, if you've got a fully compliant class, are they necessarily learning? And what are they gonna bring to the wider world and the world of work if they aren't able to express themselves or be able to identify where their strengths and weaknesses are, where they're not able to follow their strengths and respond and behave in a uniform way? I just don't think it allows for creativity, send neurodivergent learners. I think it's unrealistic, and, compliance doesn't mean learning.
That's really important, isn't it? So yeah, tell me about like some of the impacts then that you're seeing. Well, yeah, going back to your own practice in the pupil referral unit, what kind of impacts and difference does it make taking a more relational approach?
Uh, Holding a child in positive high regard and being solution focused with them, because often a child would come into a pupil referral unit who, on the sixth day of exclusion, has left what they knew, their friendship groups, their sense of belonging, and arrive in a pupil referral unit. So there's no why would they trust anything that we say or do? So paramount is to build a relationship, and then together with the family and them to think about what can help change for them to get them either back into a mainstream setting or into a position where they're going into the world of work or post 16 with a sense of hope and belonging and attachment and a positive experience. So I think I always had to, I wouldn't do it any other way. I would always come into that relationship knowing that things had gone very wrong for them, but actually there was a way through this. Now, the argument, I suppose, from my perspective is that that discussion and that hope and that the sense of opportunity and purpose needs to come from far earlier along in their educational space. Sometimes it was a little too late, you know, and I think my focus and the reason for going into this role is to look at early intervention and what can change much earlier along on that path, and about teachers noticing. I mean, you would have children who would arrive at an alternative provision with unmet needs, and very early on you realise that were some send needs that weren't met, and the behaviour was not seen as a communication of unmet needs, but of an unwillingness to adapt to the rules and the behaviour policy of the school. Yeah, so I think it's about me knowing and really getting a sense of the thoughts and feelings of the child and the parent in on that 6th day when the world is just taken from them, and, you know, some quite palpable emotions are brought to that space, and I suppose it's made me reconsider where best to put my energies in terms of bringing a sense of hope and change for a young person, and much earlier on in the journey for them, so that we've got more time to get things right and make sure the education system works for them and the parents.
I think I was talking with someone the other day about, I noticed like in teacher taps surveys, teachers about their feelings about behavior and disruptions. And it seems to be actually, it's at primary level, I think in their latest behavior report, it's at the primary, that sense of, yes, my lessons are being disrupted, things are happening, and perhaps behavior is a rising challenge. We need to start earlier. And it makes me quite sad when you see, I don't know, head teachers, school leaders coming to a point where they say, oh, gosh, the only way I think this child can get the help, will access the help and services they need, is to exclude them.
And the resources aren't necessarily there. So I can see why there may be a thought that if you do exclude, then the resources will materialise, but we know we're in a SEND crisis and the resources aren't there. Now, I'd much rather see the 18 to 20,000 pounds that's spent on a pupil when they're excluded from school being pumped into the system a lot earlier on to avoid that huge cost. And we do talk, I don't particularly like it, but we do talk about the approved to prison pipeline. I do acknowledge that in some regard. It's not always the case. But that's an awful lot of money that could be saved if that intervention was put in much earlier for young people. And it's also giving teachers in schools the right support. I'm a strong advocate of, but it costs way too much money, is supervision for staff in schools around behaviour, around the feelings that are provoked by behaviour, and the space and the reflective space to think about how things could be different in a much more solution focused way. But I acknowledge that that costs a lot of money, and that's not somewhere where the education system's necessarily going. The other consideration is that the transition from primary to secondary is huge. When you're in a small, nurturing environment where parents feel connected to a school community, to go into a much larger school that may have a very different behaviour policy and attitude, what needs to change in that transition conversation to ensure that children, particularly children with SEND, feel that they belong and are safe in a much larger environment. So I think there are far more considerations to bring to bear on the education system as a whole and the systemic system, which may nut out in the long run this concern that teachers have around behaviour in the classroom. So obviously it's a funding issue, it's a resource issue.
And that transition issue, isn't it? I think is being highlighted again in like research being done by the engagement platform and showing that this drop off in a
Mm.
sense of engagement and belonging that comes in year 7. Yes, if secondary schools can do some more learning from primaries about how you actually build that sense of belonging, build connections with families.
Yeah, it's a mutual learning space, and I think there has to be a space and a conversation within that transition across schools to ensure that there is that consistency of approach and there is that lead up. I did some pupil voice in a primary school, and it was actually around rights respecting schools. And I know the Mayor of London has introduced the Rights Respecting Schools Award free to schools pan London. So I was in that kind of space. And I was with year fours who at that point were sharing anxiety concern around secondary school. So when are we having that conversation? Year 6 is too late. Year 5 might be too late. What are we doing to bridge that gap between primary and secondary so that there is that continuity and feeling of safety and building of that resilience, I suppose. You've got parental choice around secondary schools as well. So it's not just a case of child going from their local primary to their local secondary by any means. It's far more nuanced. And I think that there needs to be a larger discussion around periods of transition, not just primary to secondary, but also phase transition and then secondary to post 16.
And sometimes, isn't it, even primary, going from one year group to another, that involves
Yeah,
a change of teacher, doesn't it? Or as you
it
say, it could
does.
be a bit of a change of approach, and that brings up some difficulties. But I think it's also and this is the Creating Value in Schools podcast. So one of the
Mm.
things we're always interested in is about that value and resources and how we make best value get the most from our resources. And I think it's quite interesting to think about actually that, putting in approaches earlier, giving staff those tools, as you say, helping staff to try and be that calm adult in the room or in the space, supervision if possible. That might then help save some money further down the line. Because again,
Mm.
it is something that's coming to people's attention more now, isn't it? Is that alternative provisions and things can be very costly.
And there's a move, as we know, with the new announcements to be made around inclusions in school and spaces in schools to be inclusive. I did see a DFE video about what an inclusive space looked like. I wasn't wholly enamoured because I've seen some lovely inclusive spaces in schools that are far more creative, shall we say. So yeah, it's a work in progress, I think.
Yes, it's interesting, isn't it, with this new Ofsted and yes, DfE focus on inclusion, but as you say, we haven't necessarily all come to that shared understanding. And maybe it does look different in different places. And actually, Dee, it'd be great to hear a few suggestions from you, because I think with your experience and the work you're doing currently, and then you are quite used to working in a multi-agency way and with
Mm.
different stakeholders. And sometimes that is something that comes up that can be not always the easiest thing for people in schools to do. So, any suggestions for helping that multi-agency working and getting the most from it?
I suppose I've done it for so long now, it's second place, but you are again, I mean, relational practices are important. Understanding how different stakeholder groups that there is a difference in vocabulary and approach and respecting that and actually finding the common ground. I know from the work I'm currently doing with social care and other agencies, it's about finding that commonality in approach. And it may be different, it may sound different, but actually I think you have to go into it knowing that the group, the stakeholder, the agency is in it for the best interest of the child. Again, it comes down to understanding of place and space and being respectful of what another agency brings to that equation. So, holding in high regard and respect the work of EPs, for example, or social workers, and seeing how you can, as a group, come up with a solution for a family or a child or a scenario, rather than thinking that one stance is more superior than another. So, yeah, it's about building those relationships with professionals and coming up with agreed vocabulary and agreed approach.
It comes back almost that idea of scripts again, or
Yeah.
let's have that consistency of the way we speak and the way we talk. And so,
It's not easy because that, you do see conflict in that space, but sometimes it's about getting through those challenging conversations and uncomfortable conversations sometimes, because you've got to prioritize the needs of the child above all else. And so getting to that shared understanding is so important.
and maybe there are some feelings and other things to unpack and work through in order
Yeah.
to get there.
Storming, forming, norming, reforming, back to that group dynamics, and working through those dynamics is important, and being able to be self-reflective actually and think about what am I bringing to that space, and do I need to listen, be a proper active listener and take on board what other people are saying.
And so, Dee, for anyone who wants to explore this a bit further, can you share any recommended reads, or is there anything you've been reading or listening to recently?
Well,
Nice.
there's a few books I was reflecting on today, only because normally I would be on half term, but I haven't been because I've changed my role. Come from a very institutionalized teacher. And I've been leaning back into Atomic Habits because it's a book that I read last, I think it was the summer before last actually. And I was thinking about, the habits and practices that you develop and form that bring you to that reflective, calm space, and I was reflecting on that book this week. The other recommendations I would give, and they've come up quite often, is The Anxious Generation, because that's really helpful. And there's such a lot in there around the use of social media and the feelings of the child. And there's a great chapter on play and how that helps young people. That one. And I've been reading, I'm in the process of revisiting and reading White Fragility,
Wow.
because a piece of work that I'm doing at the moment is around race equality, suspensions and exclusions, and how to think about the experience of Black Caribbean, Black, White Caribbean and Somali children in the education system, and the disproportionality in exclusions and suspensions. And I do encourage people to read this if you are, a white leader in a school, to think about why sometimes it's hard for white people to talk about racism. So that's another recommendation. And because I'm looking at things from a trauma-informed perspective a lot, and again, this is something I dip in and out of. It's a heavy book, so it's not something you can read from beginning to end. The Body Keeps the Score. To think about how our bodies hold our trauma, our minds, our bodies hold, and our brains hold trauma. And those reading for me are just texts which I think get me to sit in that reflective space, particularly because I'm going into lots of schools from cross phases. So I do like to pull back sometimes and consider how my reading informs my next steps.
That sounds brilliant. Thank you, Dee. And we will add those recommendations to the Creating Value in Schools bookshops, and I'll put links in the show notes. But really great suggestions there. And yes, and what you're saying brings us back to that idea, I think, of equity and access and opportunities for learning. So thank you very much, Dee. It's been brilliant to chat to you, and I hope that the work continues to go well.
Thank you for having me. It's been a pleasure. Thank you.